for the time together this morning. Give you thanks as we come together to learn about how to be Christians in this secular world. So guide us. I pray for a deeper understanding and how to live as Christians in this world. As I pray in Christ's name. Amen.
So I just want to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Michelin. He is a professor at Huron at the licentiate program in the odd time. And at the odd time, he's also the professor at Wycliffe. He has been a close friend and a mentor in the last few years, especially forming me theologically as we go forward. So thank you for coming here and speaking to us. So over to you.
Well, thanks, guys, for coming this morning. I'm glad I try not to fall asleep, okay, over there. It's really good to be here. And this is an area of topic that I think is really important for us to understand, not just as Anglicans, although I'm going to try to gear it that way as Anglicans, and how to speak and live in this secular cultural world, but for all churches. So I'm glad you could be here. So what I'm going to do in these 3 sessions together is I'm going to talk about or argue that our sense of ourself or the relationship to the world, people, and God are not fundamentally shaped by what we think. Okay? They're not fundamentally shaped by what we think about certain ideas or certain worldviews or philosophies. Not that those things are not important. Obviously, I'm an academic background. I've read and taught in these areas, so I'm not saying these are not important. But I do believe if we are to more fully understand what it means to live in today's cultural or secular culture, whether you're an atheist, you're agnostic, a Christian, we must take into consideration, as I believe the ancient thinkers did, like Plato and Augustine and others, and now this modern philosopher that I'm going to tap into called Charles Taylor. He's a Canadian philosopher, retired. He used to teach at Montreal McGill. And James K. Smith, he's another Canadian from the Reformed tradition. He teaches down in the States. Basically, both of them say that what shapes who we are is what we love. What shapes who we are is what we ultimately love. And this love then forms who we are, and most of the times in very non-cognitive ways. In ways we're actually not thinking about, just in our sort of being in the world, moving around without even thinking about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look first at Charles Taylor in his first session, what he says about the notion of the secular self, and how we've come to the point now that basically most people, or a lot of people at least, no longer believe in God. But what he gets at is more what it feels like to be in this situation. And so I'm going to try to expand and explain on that. Then we're going to talk about, in the second talk, we're going to look at James Smith's proposal that we are fundamentally creatures who are shaped by what we ultimately love and worship. He's basically borrowing a lot of stuff from St. Augustine, who says the same thing. And in the third and last talk, we're going to talk about him. And then at the end of the talk, bring in Anglican resources that I believe are actually quite Augustinian, that can help us as Christians be formed in a Christian way rather than let the secular stuff out there form us. Okay? Does that make sense? What we're going to do? All right. So let's start with Charles Taylor. So today's secular person is oriented by all sorts of longings, projections, all sorts of quests of significance. But many of them have constructed their sense of what's important for them in their life without any sense of God. And so the question for Taylor is, and hopefully for us, is why? So he's not interested as much in what people believe as much as what for us is believable. In other words, what are the conditions of belief or unbelief in the secular world for the secular person and for ourselves? So for Taylor, this emergence of the secular is not kind of a neutral, rational, a-religious world, as we might think, that is left over once we've kind of thrown off all religious superstition, ritual, and belief in God. So if we just get rid of all the Christian bits, Quebec's a prime example. Let's get rid of all the signs, all the symbols, everything. Boom, we're going to be just purely secular. He doesn't believe that. Because secular is not just an unbelief or a lack of religious beliefs. It's actually the emergence of a production of a new faith option. The possibility in this faith option for Taylor is exclusive humanism. Exclusive humanism, totally void of God, but able to somehow come up with a sense of constructing meaning and significance in one's life without any reference to God whatsoever. Because people need some sense of purpose, some sense of meaning in their life, and they're going to look for it in one way or another. So we've not just stopped believing as a society in God, we also had to be able to now imagine some significance to what Taylor now calls that we live within an immanent frame. So imagine a picture with a frame, okay? And the whole meaning of that picture and everything is within that frame. Nothing can come out from outside of it. And likewise, we live in this cultural space with secular stories that are all assumed to live within this frame. There's nothing from outside, nothing from God, a transcendence, sense of magic, or any of this sort of stuff. And Taylor calls this, he says, this is our assumed social imaginary. We all have an assumed social imaginary. And for the typical secular person, social imaginary is that they live within this immanent frame. Does that make sense to you, what I just said? Okay? If you ask it, don't hesitate to stop and ask a question. Okay? I like to push lay people. I don't like to talk down. I'd rather pull you up. I find that's not as disrespectful of you, frankly, and I think you're more than capable of being pulled up to learn more deeper stuff. So social imaginary. It means this take it for granted context or framework that we just assume. The person just assumes it's unacknowledged by the person. So again, Taylor, when he talks about social imaginary, is not addressing how people think, but what is it that we take for granted, assume, and don't even give a second thought about? So social imaginary does not refer to the way people think about the world, but what they imagine it to be, and thus act intuitively in relationship to it. So let me give you an example. I remember talking with a family friend at a wedding, and a family friend and I don't know how we got to this point, but sometimes this happens because they know I'm a priest and blah, blah. And he goes on and says, what's most important for me, this is his understanding of human flourishing or meaning of life. What matters to me is to be a good person. That's what ultimately matters to me. I said, oh, that's wonderful that you want to be a good person. How do you know you're a good person? Oh, I don't know. It just comes from here. Okay, well, how did that here get shaped? What does that look like? Stop. No more conversation. It's over. Right? It's a prime example of this kind of assumed social imaginary. It just assumes that somehow he knows or she knows exactly what is right and wrong and what it means to be a good person. Love's another category we toss out there all the time and think we know exactly what love means when in fact we don't. Now, again, in this social imaginary, what's really happened, like in this whole book, Secular Age, that he reads, I don't suggest you read the book, it's like 600 pages. He talks also about how it was that a few hundred years ago, everybody believed in God. Whether they all went to church or not, it was another question, but at least everybody assumed they believed in God. And a lot of our Western civilization has been built on those Judeo-Christian premises. And how now that is no longer the case. And along with it, we basically have a world or a culture that's no longer enchanted or embedded with spiritual forces. So God's spirit, the demonic, and certainly miracles are out of the picture. And so now that this culture or world of ours is so-called disenchanted, the locus of meaning is totally shifted from being out there, outside one's mind, to inside oneself, just like that friend I talked about, that illustration. Okay? The philosopher Descartes started all this with, he said, I think, therefore I am. And Kant's another philosopher who made this big shift, and I'm not going to go into all the details about that. But that shift happened, and that's part of the reason why we are where we are. So let me try to explain a little bit this shift from the pre-modern, when we kind of believed that everything was loaded with significance, meaning, spirits, the devil, miracles, and all that sort of stuff. In that kind of pre-enchanted world, so he's talking way back in medieval days, but right up into probably the 18th century, it was assumed that things themselves had power in them. So we still practice that in the Anglican Church. Obviously the host on Sunday mornings. But in higher church situations, other elements are considered to have sort of kind of an inherent spiritual power in them. So relics, for instance, in the Roman Catholic Church still have that sense of, okay, there's something holy, there's some kind of power here. And so people will line up and kiss the relic or kiss the place where the relics are, etc. So that's what most of the culture and most people all bought into, and now have not. So then Taylor introduces two key concepts to help us understand how this shift from kind of an enchanted world to a non-enchanted world happened. So the pre-modern enchanted person he calls a porous self. So imagine what porous means. Something that is porous allows things to come into it, filter into it. It makes it vulnerable, in a sense, to outside power, curses, blessings, or of course God's intervening grace. So when we receive Holy Communion on Sunday morning, we believe that we are porous to Christ's real effective presence and thus transforming grace on Sunday mornings when we receive Holy Communion. That's an example of being porous. Whereas today's post-God secular self, he describes as buffered. Okay. Describes them as buffered, so framed in, blocked off from all forces of meaning. So the buffered self, we no longer think of the world as having any given order and meaning which human beings believe they must discover and conform to. So there's no sense of, again, that immanent frame. There's no sense of something like heaven and angels, God, a truth out there that we sort of buy into anymore. That's out of the picture. We are all brought in within this immanent frame, and this immanent frame is often little old me. Right? Again, I go back to that person I was talking to. Where does he get a sense of what's right and wrong? He's the frame. It's him. It's all within that frame of himself. Okay? Now, what he doesn't realize, and what most people don't realize, they're still being influenced. And we'll talk more about that with James Smith. You might think that, oh yeah, I'm totally within my frame and I'm totally perceiving this all by my little old self. but you're being influenced by outside sources all the time, whether you know it or not. So what's the consequence of this buffered self? Well, I think as I suggested to you, is that you then have the relativization of truth, right? It just naturally comes that way. There's a deep skepticism of any truth claims, except one's own, of course. And of course, we see this happening in our culture, especially in political circles right now. You are either on the right or you are on the left. If you're on the left, the right's your enemy. If you're on the right, the left is your enemy and wrong. And often there's nothing in between. Nietzsche talked about this, the whole notion that we can never really grasp the way things truly are. So there is no such thing as an objective truth. It's either my truth or the highway, sort of thing. Has some deep implications for how we read the Bible, which has actually influenced biblical scholarship and trickled down into church life very much. The whole notion that words actually cannot point us to an objective truth. So what we tend to do when we read the Bible is we have sort of our own ideas and experience of what we think is right or wrong. And then we read some sort of one of the stories or words, and then we adapt it to what we're already thinking. Okay. That happens all the time. And we all do it. And frankly, it's true. We all come to the Bible with the barrier of our own experience. We all come to the Bible wanting to move it in one particular direction. But that doesn't mean objectively Jesus can't inform and change us to move in his direction. I'm going to talk more about that in the last talk about how that happens. But for most of us, and I think it's really infiltrated the church as well, we've kind of given up on that idea. And we just assume, well, whether we know it or not, that we can take the Bible and then just adapt it to whatever we think. Does that make sense, you guys? Okay. Now, the other repercussion of all this is then where this kind of buffered self, naturally is disembodied from community. Disembodied from all community. If there is going to be room in society to not believe in God and thus space for this exclusive humanism, our once tied to social cohesion has to be removed. So this development of the buffered self lays the groundwork for the separation of individuals from communities. It's kind of the obvious consequence of the buffered self. Once individuals become the locus of meaning, not believing in God and going to church, well, that no longer has social consequences, right? See, some of you may remember a time when, generally speaking, not going to church did have social consequences because everybody believed in God. Now, not as much even in your days. The movement was already happening in the culture that way, but you still have some semblance of it. That the whole notion of not going to church is like, can't do that. But now it's easy because we're buffered selves. Most people assume that. That's where meaning comes from. That's where then we started getting development. Well, I can be an Anglican without going to church. Or I could be a Christian without going to church, and then the excuses are, well, the institution is corrupt and all this sort of stuff. And not to say that there's not truth to it, but a few hundred years ago, people not even imagined such a thing. Okay. Whereas right now, it's quite normal for us to think, even if we're Christians, well, I don't need community because my Christianity is now developed within this little limited frame of my own self. I get a little picture of it from here and here if I watch YouTube or something like that, and boom, off I go. Okay. The other thing, this is kind of a side issue. Our sense of time is totally changed too now in the secular age compared to pre-secular age, enchanted time. See, once everything's framed in, we no longer have a sense of eternal time, right? We no longer have a sense of eternity. And then when you no longer have a sense of eternity, that then influences even how you do liturgy, for instance. So what shapes our Anglican liturgy is our lectionary, lectionary that takes into account different saints' days, obviously the different seasons like Advent, Lent, Pentecost, etc. And when we celebrate certain days, including Christmas or whatever, eternity and our time sort of connects. We really believe they in a way connect. Because in eternal time, Jesus is risen bodily and is alive. Like we believe in a God who lives in eternity. It's hard for us to imagine, right? Because we live within time. But God created time. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit are not bounded by our time, but because Jesus became a human person, a human being, lived as we did in bodily form, now has ascended to the right hand of the Father through the Spirit. He becomes present to us in various ways, often in the sacraments, reading scripture, sometimes in private prayer, etc. But when you move away into the sort of immanent frame, that connection goes out the window. Right? And it can reflect sometimes in the way we do worship. It can reflect in the sense that, well, we don't take seriously maybe certain aspects or liturgy itself because, well, we don't really expect anything to happen. We don't believe eternity is connecting with our time. So what? Right? So that's a possible consequence. Lastly, there's two things. The other thing is, I talked about lowering the moral bar. I don't need to talk much more about that. But here's the one last thing I want to talk about. People still feel cross-pressured, as Taylor calls it, in this culture. People still are really hungry and seeking meaning and purpose in life. Some have a vague sense of the transcendent. I would also argue because we're made in the image of God, no matter how secular we become, there is still a sense in all people of that there's something beyond. That there may be some kind of God, even though they refuse to accept it. And furthermore, people, especially today, it's being noticed across churches, especially Roman Catholic and Pentecostal churches, where there's a rise of the Gen Z and Gen X or whatever group of young people starting to come back to church. And I think it's because these people are realizing, I'm trying to find meaning within this immanent frame, and it's not working. It's not working. And so we have a rise of despair. We have a rise, I think, of suicide. There's a rise of all kinds of stuff. And of course, all this kind of political division that we're experiencing within our culture is not helping this way as well. So this one atheist writer, Julian Barnes, says, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. So notice what he's saying. He says, he doesn't believe in God, but he's still, a sense, haunted by God. Or consider Steve Jobs. This is the founder of Apple. He said this when he was dying. I'm about 50-50 on believing in God. For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence than meets the eye. I like to think that something survives after you die. I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures. But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch. Click, and you're gone. Maybe that's why I never like to put on-off switches on Apple devices. And then there's David Foster Wallace is another example of his fugitive expression of doubt, longing, and faith and questioning. In his book, says Smith, documents a world of almost suffocating imminence, a flattening human universe where the escapes are boredom and distraction. Boredom and distraction. Acedia, sloth. You don't often hear those words. Is a vice that is especially being experienced amongst a lot of young people today. The seeing of sloth is not laziness per se, but it's a sense of result of living in a meaningless world. Result that I don't really care what I do. It doesn't really matter. This kind of giving up and falling into a little sense of despair. And I think it's prominent amongst a lot of our young people. And frankly, it's a result of this secular age that we live in. All right, so.
Excuse me.
Yeah, that's the first topic.
Spell that word using acedia.
Acedia, A-C-E-D-I-A, or sloth.
And that's sloth.
Sloth. That I'm hearing, just reading and hearing different preachers and everything, they're talking a lot more about that happening in our culture. Sorry.
No, don't worry about it.
Okay. So that's the picture. Please.
Perhaps you're going to get to this, but how did all of this happen in such a relatively short time?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, it didn't really happen in a relatively short time, although it's really speeded up. I've noticed since even I was in ministry over the last 30 years. It really began, some would argue it started with Protestantism. When the shift from the church telling people what to believe in shifted to the individual. And the Bible is given into individuals' hands, and okay, you can figure it out on your own. Like, I'm not against it. It's not that simple, but some will argue that began that shift away from trusting in something bigger to the individual. And then, Industrial Revolution, and then came philosophers like Descartes, Kant, French Revolution, all those things started to, but encourage people to shift away from a sense of the transcendent towards the inner self and trust in the inner self. I think part of it too is because institutions and stuff have really screwed up, right? And so we've moved away from trusting institutions. And today, that's rampant, right? There's very anti-institutional sense in our culture, which really hurts us as a church. And to a degree, they're right. But just because something's wrong doesn't mean it's all wrong. Right? So, does that make sense?
Somewhat. I have a hard time understanding how people can go through life thinking only of themselves and seeing a beginning and an ending, but living without purpose in my mind.
Well, it's also just plain the power of sin, right? It's the power of sin, and you read the Bible, and there's stories of it over and over and over again. Read the stories of the Old Testament, especially the people of God. That was constantly their problem. And the main theme over and over again is the Lord God saying, focus on me and stop focusing on yourselves or other idols. It's just a repeat of the same story, right? And let's face it, we all do the same thing. Just because we call ourselves Christian does not mean in our own little small ways or degrees, we don't do the same thing at times. So it's important to recognize it in ourselves, and then you can start to imagine how it can take on bigger shape and form. Yeah.
I picture these people you're describing as being very protective of themselves too. And you said this framework, you don't want any outside influence, even though it's pretty difficult. So I'm picturing somebody who thinks they're good, ethically and morally, but they have no idea what social justice is. To be advocates for the rights of people, the Aboriginal, you know what I'm getting at? If you say there's no social aspect, the way they keep that frame around themselves. So
that's a good question. First of all, when this language Taylor's using, people are not out there using that language, right? These are just descriptives, metaphors for us to try to understand what's happening out there. So people are not walking around thinking, well, I live in an inner frame. They're not thinking that way. Because what Taylor's trying to describe is what people are assuming, and you're going to hear more about it from Smith. They have no idea what they're assuming. They just are assuming stuff, and we all do it. So, for instance, Smith's going to talk about that. You just assume you know how to brush your teeth. You don't think about how you're going to brush your teeth, do you? It's just time of the night. You go there, you can pick up your toothbrush, you put the brush your teeth, and off you go. So we'll talk more about that in the second part. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Was there something else you said? Was there some other aspect of your question?
Just how they can be so inward that they're not even.
Well, the other thing is, I don't think people actually think they're being inward necessarily. Again, power of sin is very helpful here too. We can think that we're very outward thinking and engaged in social justice and contributing to it and all these sort of things. And it doesn't mean that there's not any good thing that's happening within the secular world. I want to say that there are good things. People are doing, even if they don't believe in God whatsoever, it's not like nobody's doing any good things. You're like your organization, there's organizations that are not led by Christian people that are doing some good things out there, seeking to feed people on the street. All right, so it's not totally void of that either. Okay, yeah.
It seems to me that it takes a lot of work to live in your little picture, because you have to rely just on yourself and keep yourself going. Whereas for us on the other side, we rely on Jesus. We give our life to Jesus, and like for me, I just trusted Him. Everything will be fine. I trust in the Lord. So that's where I think too that they make life vulnerable.
What do you people think? Do you think that's true? It's easier to be living as a Christian, opening oneself up, or living within the inner frame?
Oh, it's much easier.
You think it's more easier to live in an inner
Oh, really?
I don't.
I know.
You're wrong. Christian is hard.
Well, it's going to be interesting. Go
But
ahead.
I think you live with, you're able to live with more joy in life, right? So although it's difficult, I think it's more difficult to have nothing like that's like everybody believes in something, whether it's that they believe there is no God or there is a God or whatever. But I think having to just rely on yourself, thinking that you're the one who's in control, well, that means when things go bad, you're at fault. So then you are left with all this self-blame and self-hatred because you only have yourself to blame. Too, right? Like it's all on you. When things go right, then that's great. You can just say, I'm awesome. But when things don't go well, if you don't have somebody to pray to or somebody to be thinking, there's a reason for this, there's something outside of myself, and someday I'll understand why this is happening, but if you don't have any of that, then that's a hard road to live.
I think it's going to be interesting to see what you say towards the end. I think it all depends what assumed social imaginary you're coming out of. You're assuming a certain social imaginary. You're pointing out another assumed social imaginary. And I have friends who don't think their way at all. They assume their life is tickety-boo.
They assume what?
It's tickety-boo. Sorry, that's a.
Oh, sorry.
It's just
Yeah,
going.
no, I know
It's just going great.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to hear what you say when I talk about the kind of practices I suggest we engage in for the Christian life that I know I find difficult. And frankly, I can see why it's easier to be a secular person. I agree with you that the joy and everything and purpose and meaning that comes from following and being in Christ is the absolute, is the far superior. But I can also see why people are tempted into seeking everything you want just within this world, and how easy it can be.
And I also think that who's swimming against the tide? The secular person?
Yeah.
Or the Christian? So just think from that perspective alone, right?
Yes.
Even if you do nothing, you're moving along the secular. So to say it's easier to be a Christian, yes, we see that we get the fruits, but that's not the same thing, right?
I think that's a really good way of putting it, is what you're swimming against. And the other hard part about the Christian thing is you're swimming against it within your own church sometimes. It's not just against what people are thinking outside the church. Because we're pretty divided within the church. And we clergy experience it more particularly. But you have to name it, from my mind, if we're going to really move forward in a positive direction. Part of the talking about this stuff is it's happening within the local church. Yeah, sorry.
In the way of doing some very helpful one of the things that you referred to and haven't been much about, but that's actually the law of God. And I think that the whole question about how easy is it or how difficult is it to find meaning. The thing is that since the Enlightenment in the 18th century, we've laid it out really quickly and well, also the French Revolution, the whole idea is that people began to reject the idea that love actually involved.
That's a good point.
Moral law. And so when people say this just feels natural, I'm saying it feels natural because of the fact that what they rejected is it right? Is something that is in accordance with God's laws? So I think that that's one of the really difficult things that although a lot of secular folk do, especially young people, are feeling kind of dissonance and feeling they get lost. That doesn't mean that a lot of them are naturally wishing that they could also be told again, you got to go to bed at a certain time, you can't watch this, you can't do that. So that's the things that really complicate it. That we really do like to be our own boss, and that's the natural thing about being sinful.
Yeah, now that's a really good point too. And the natural law is really important too. I don't really bring that in, but that's really important too. And I was kind of hinting at it, the fact that we're made in the image of God. There is a sense that God is operative in our lives, whether we know it or not. But when you lose the sense of God's revelation, and that the Christian sense, that gets questioned and gets thrown out of shape very easily.
So one of the things I think you really put a finger on is I've been struggling to figure out, why don't people come to church when I just tell them about Jesus? Right? I'm like, hey, I got the best news for you. Right? Like, here is truth. Here it is. And then they're like, oh yeah, that's really good for you.
Yeah.
But I'm going to keep doing whatever I want to keep doing. Right? And I think you put a finger on it in that if they're not porous, if we're living in a culture that says, I'm rubber, you're glue, whatever you say bounces off me and sticks to you, right? Like, whatever I tell them about Jesus, they're like, good for you, right? That's like that bounce back. Good for you, but it's not for me. So we don't like, or neither do they want anything outside of themselves telling them what is true, what is real. And in fact, I think we're seeing this in our culture right now. They don't like to be challenged. The secular person doesn't like to be challenged on what they believe, because that is an identity crisis, not just a different thought, right? It's no. Because if I'm living in the immanent frame, then my worldview, who I am, has to be so protected from everything on the outside. Because the moment that something bad happens, or it doesn't fit in my frame, my whole world comes crumbling down. So if I believe that there is no God, and I look at myself, inside myself, where there is no God, I'm like, yeah, cool. I look inside, I meditate or whatever, there's no God. And then some guy comes along in a clergy shirt and goes, yeah, but there is. If I believe that, everything else I believe is wrong.
We're going to exactly deal with that in a second.
Okay.
But no, you're hit the head of the nail.
Yeah.
And then the second talk with Smith is going to address the whole notion of worldviews and why that doesn't work. And then as we go towards the last talk, I'm going to suggest what I think does work. And it's definitely not at the level of arguing worldviews. I don't think that works. I think that's what we've bought into, especially in evangelical world, frankly. That if we can just argue better, we're going to draw them in. That does not mean we should not be really thoughtful and think through things as we're trying to do now, that preaching is not really important. That does not, I'm not saying that. But something else needs to happen, I believe, to tap into people, which I think is what is happening with some young people today who are starting to come back.
And just to link with Jacob, who's saying, and Anne too, outsiders look at us and all they see is the legalism. And we don't have that legalism if we are truly filled with that joy. But at the same time, there are secular people who have rules and boundaries. I mean, they give us that sense of safety too. You don't want to just not know what to expect.
Yeah.
So there have to be these God laws. And I think even secular people, even St. Paul said that the Gentiles had their own set of rules and they were good people.
Yeah, giving up what we do as Christians on Sunday morning, that's not the answer. But there is a question about how we do it and do it well that we'll again talk about in a moment. I could just give you the answer, but I don't want to, because there's a bunch of other stuff that's going to connect you to it that will help you see it, I hope, a little better. So you've got a good point. Should we take a break? Oh, go ahead, please.
If someone tells you that they're a Christian and they believe in God, and you turn around and they disappoint you by the way they do things and act with things, and you pray to get them that to God for them, how do you get that trust back to believe in them again?
So are you talking about the person who you talk to or the Christian?
The person that I talk to, yeah.
Oh, that's a really good thing. I think I was just listening to a podcast about the Jesus forgiving somebody 770 times. It does not, whatever. It doesn't mean you don't call people to account or anything like that, but it does mean that I think St. Paul teaches us clearly to be incredibly patient and to be incredibly continue to be engaged with the person and loving. It's like basically raising a child, especially now young adult children, which are becoming really, they're tending to take a long time to grow up. And I have some personal experience around this with my own, where you call them to account, you set some boundaries, they screw up, but you don't stop loving them. You don't stop giving them another chance, but encouraging them in this direction. Building up that sense of trust, that they have a sense that you are in their corner and love them. You may not love what they're doing, but they get a sense that you love them and are in their corner. And that there's no exact formula to that. That's something you just practice and work out with whomever you're dealing with. Do you have a break? Let's have a break. Thank you, Mike.